She had a very clear plan for this little boy who was laying on this little gurney crying, but he didn't have any tears because he was so dehydrated.
But the greatest challenge facing the world in the new millennium is the growing disparity between the wealthy nations and the poor nations of the world. Of the 2.6 billion people in our world who live on less than $2 a day, hundreds of millions of those people are believers in Jesus Christ, followers of Jesus Christ. But they're desperately poor. They don't have clean water. They don't have food to eat or feed their children. They haven't been inoculated against terrible diseases. And they suffer from all of the scourges of poverty. But we can make a difference. We can make a difference in their lives because the community, the body of Christ, the body of Christians worldwide, we were meant to come together in ways that would benefit each other, to lift one another up, to feel the pain and carry the burdens of our fellow believers. And that's what we have the opportunity to do as we go out in the name of Christ and we share what God's given to us and the plenty and the prosperity that He's given us, that we have an opportunity to share that with the world.
I want you to look into the faces of these beautiful children and this wonderful family. They deserve everything that we have. They deserve every opportunity to thrive physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
One of the things I've learned over the years in my work is how very hard it is, or seems to be for most of us, to feel an emotional connection to people or children 10,000 miles away. It just doesn't feel the same when we don't know them, we don't know anything about their life story. Maybe they're culturally different than we are, they're racially different than we are. They just seem very strange and different compared to our own experience. And it's hard, I think, the way we're wired to muster that compassion for what I've come to call other people's kids. We don't have any trouble mustering compassion for our kids when something happens to them, or they're sick, or they're ill, or our friends' children, or our neighbors' children. It just comes naturally when you see a child in need, and you, especially if you know the family or you know the children, we respond.
I think one of the keys is to realize that the people around the world have the same kinds of feelings and hopes, expectations for their children as we do. That really hit home for me. I was in a triage tent in Niger during a time of famine. There had been a locust invasion, the rains had not come, and so the very poorest of the poor were suffering intensely, so much so that many children were on their deathbeds. So I was in one of these tents, walking around, talking to the parents, looking at the children, and came to find this young woman who had brought her little boy, Sahibi Ibrahim. He was obviously very sick, and I said, well, why didn't you bring him earlier? And she said, oh, up until yesterday, I didn't have the money to pay for the bus. You know, realizing that the cost of a cup of coffee was all that stood between medical care for Sahibi Ibrahim and certain death. And as we talked, this young woman, she was a young mom, only 17 years old, and I said, well, tell me about this little boy. Tell me what are your hopes and dreams for him? And she was very articulate. She said, well, I hope that he becomes a nurse, and I want him to have a good education because I know education is the key to keeping him well. And I want him to become a nurse because I want him to go back to our village. I want him to be able to care for other children like him. She had a very clear plan for this little boy who was laying on this little gurney crying, but he didn't have any tears because he was so dehydrated. You know, he was just so close to death, and yet she had a very clear set of expectations for what would become of this little boy were he to survive. And I thought, you know, she's like me. She has the same hopes and dreams and expectations for her children that I have. And if I can remember that when I hear a newscast or see something on the television about a famine or a war, and realizing that there are mothers and fathers who have the very same hopes and dreams for their kids as I do for my 5, it makes it harder for them to look like somebody else's children. They're just like mine, and I need to respond in the same way to them as I do to my very own kids.
But when we turn on the TV and we see children that might be suffering because of hunger or lack of clean water, or they've got malaria or HIV/AIDS, or maybe they're orphaned, we certainly feel a moment of sadness. If we have a heart beating in our chest, we feel a moment of sadness, but we change the channel, we move on to the next program, and we go on with our lives. But how would we feel if we opened the door tomorrow morning, let's say on the way to church, and there on our doorstep was one of these children, broken and hurting, maybe bleeding or starving, obviously in need of help? Would any of us change the channel? Would any of us step over that child, get in our car and go to church? Well, of course we wouldn't. We would immediately pick up the child, we'd call 911, or we'd put him in the car and rush him to the hospital or a doctor. And we'd say, whatever it takes, we want this child to be helped. We found this child on our doorstep this morning. We need to do something. You see, all of a sudden, the plight of that child was not a newspaper headline or a news story. It was personal. It was a real child that we saw on our way in our life out the door and on our way to church, and we respond as human beings. We've got to get ourselves to a place where we ask God to help us feel that way about all children. I like to say that, you know, God doesn't gauge his level of compassion and love for people based on their zip code. Oh, those people live in another country, so I don't really care about them, or I don't really love them. Of course God doesn't do that. God loves all of the children in our world who are in need, and his heart breaks for them. And his heart breaks for us when we do nothing to respond to those needs, when we turn our back on these children that he loves so much. I had the opportunity in 1999 to work alongside former President Jimmy Carter in a Habitat for Humanity building project in the Philippines. And during the course of our work days, he shared with me that he'd been invited by the Nobel Committee to speak on the topic, what is the greatest challenge facing the world in the new millennium? We were just at the verge of the turn of the new millennium, and he shared with me that he'd thought a lot about this, and he'd thought it through. And of course, here's a man that was President of the United States. He's traveled to more than 200 countries around the world. He's on a first-name basis with every world leader of the last quarter of a century. And what he came down to was this conclusion, that the greatest challenge facing the world in the new millennium is the growing disparity between the wealthy nations and the poor nations of the world. Now, it's interesting that he didn't choose famine. He didn't choose poverty itself. He didn't choose global terrorism or ethnic tensions or religious hatred or disease or some of the things that you or I might have chosen. He talked about the disparity and the growing disparity, the chasm, he called it, between the wealthy and the poor in our world. Because if all the world is wealthy, there's no disparity. If all the world is poor, there is no disparity. There's no inequality. But it's when some of us are very wealthy and some of us are extremely poor that there's this great chasm of disparity, and there's need on the one hand and plenty on the other. And I think President Carter was very profound in that. And as we look at the world, most of us don't really understand the depth and the breadth and the size of the problems facing our world. I sometimes say our world is on fire. Our world is burning with poverty and disease and marginalization and violence and violence against women, and so many of the social problems that I get to see firsthand in my travels. And I think the question God puts before all of us is, what will you do about it? What are we going to do about that disparity and poverty in our world? I want each of you to imagine for a moment that tomorrow you wake up and you go pick up the newspaper on your front step and you see the following headline: 100 jetliners crash, 26,000 dead. Now, I can't imagine a much more shocking headline maybe 9/11 was that shocking to the United States. But can you imagine what would happen if that headline appeared in your newspaper tomorrow morning? Can you imagine what the world governments would be doing? Parliaments and Congresses would be convening. Presidents and prime ministers would be addressing the nation. The nations of the world would be in an uproar over trying to get to the bottom of how did this terrible tragedy happen. Certainly we know that when even one jetliner crashes, it makes the headlines in all the newspapers of the world, all around the world, when one crashes. So it's hard to imagine what would happen if 100 jetliners crashed in one day, killing, let's say, 26,000 people. Can you imagine the blizzard of media coverage, the round-the-clock coverage of CNN and CNBC and the major networks and Fox News? It would be on every newspaper, every magazine, every TV channel, all over the internet, constantly for weeks and weeks and weeks, as the NTSB and the FAA held hearings and investigations were launched, because a tragedy like that should never be allowed to happen, even once. But you know, the really uncomfortable truth about this is that that very tragedy happened today. And it happened yesterday, and it will happen tomorrow and the next day and the day after that as well. Why? Because 26,500 children under the age of 5 die every single day of causes, preventable causes, because of their poverty. These are deaths that are needless. These are deaths that can be easily prevented. And yet, where is the news coverage? Where is Anderson Cooper when we need him? Where are the headlines? Where are the presidents and prime ministers, the parliaments and congresses holding hearings to solve this problem? Why is no one listening? Well, the answer is they're not our children. They're somebody else's children. They're anonymous. They're faceless. We don't know their names. We don't know their circumstances. We don't know their mother or father. But it doesn't make their deaths any less tragic. If there was one statistic I could give you about the world we live in, it would be that one. 26,575 children die every single day of causes that are preventable due to their poverty. We can do something about that. I believe God calls us, commands us to do something about that. And that one statistic probably more than any summarizes the opportunity that we have before us to reach out into the pain of the world and to touch it in the name of Christ.